Snow fell like sifted sorrow over the town of Sparrows Hollow, soft and soundless, covering roofs and regrets alike. It coated the chapel steps in morning white, layered the shoulders of the silent crowd gathered outside, and melted unnoticed against the cheeks of Lilah Vance. She didn't cry. Her mother would have said that was unbecoming, and besides, crying hadn't ever changed a thing. Not when Ma took sick, not when Pa stopped looking people in the eye, and not now, certainly not now, as she stood in a borrowed dress stitched tight at the ribs, waiting for the door to open and the treaty to begin. The church bell did not toll. The preacher didn't smile. No songs, no flowers, no idle chatter. Only the scent of burning pine and distant tobacco, only boots scuffing wood floors, and the rustle of petticoats worn in judgment. She walked down the aisle alone. There was no groom waiting beneath a cross or arch. Only a man stood beside the preacher, tall, silent, and still as a pillar carved from dark stone. He wore a beaded sash across his chest, and a long braid that brushed his shoulder, a hawk feather woven into it. His eyes were unreadable, as if they'd already seen the end of the world and found nothing surprising since. Lilah stopped 2 feet from him and stared at the knot of cord in the preacher's hands. She could feel every eye in the pews, like 100 pins prickling her spine. Ruth sat in the second row, her legs too short for the bench, white blonde hair in disarray. She waved, only once, only small, and Lilah swallowed hard. "Tohano of the Red Willow Apache," the preacher began, dry-throated and fumbling through words like they were foreign, "and Lilah Vance of Sparrows Hollow, do now enter into peaceful covenant, as agreed by both tribal and settler councils, too." She stopped hearing him. Her father wasn't here. He had left after signing the agreement, before sun up. Said he couldn't watch what he'd done. Said it was the only way to keep Ruth safe from war. Said too much and not enough. Lilah had listened to the horse hooves vanish down the road, alone in the house where Ma once hummed to warm the silence. The preacher tied their hands loosely. A cord of red and white, frayed and faded. Tohano's hands were warm, rough with work. He didn't look at her. Not in the way most men did. Not at all, really. As if to look too long might be rude. Or dangerous. "You may exchange a token," the preacher said, barely meeting their eyes. Tohano reached into his coat, slowly, and withdrew a carved wooden comb. It was smooth and polished, the wood dark with inlaid turquoise at its edge. He held it out, palm open. Lilah looked at it, then at him. She didn't move. The silence stretched. The church creaked. Outside, the snow deepened. She turned her face away. After a pause, he returned the comb to his coat and nodded once. Not hurt, not angry, just accepting, as if he'd already known. The preacher muttered a final blessing. Someone coughed. Mrs. Prim clicked her tongue like she tasted something sour. It was done. The walk back down the aisle felt longer than the walk-in. No one threw rice. No one offered congratulations. She heard them whisper behind gloved fingers. "Poor girl. She's nothing now. Better dead than given." Ruth tried to run to her, but a neighbor woman pulled her back, murmuring about distance and decency. Lilah saw her sister's lips form the word "why" again and again. Tohano had tied 2 horses outside, one for her. He held the reins out, not assuming, not commanding, just offering. She climbed up without help. They rode out beneath a sky of pewter gray, past men who wouldn't meet her eyes and women who judged her with theirs. Her boots were muddy. Her veil had come loose and tangled in the wind. Her hands ached from clutching the saddle. Halfway up the ridge, she turned to look back. Sparrows Hollow looked small from here, like a child's toy set in winter ash. No one waved. No one called out. Only the wind answered, lifting her hair like a whisper too late. They rode for hours through pine and stone, past cliffs where hawks circled, past streams frozen over like glass laid down by heaven itself. Tohano said nothing, but he did not ride ahead of her. He stayed beside, matched her pace, always watching the trail, always listening. By dusk, smoke curled ahead, thin, fragrant, wood smoke laced with herbs she didn't recognize. His home stood beneath a rocky outcrop, built of timber and mud, low-roofed and warm-looking. She dismounted and followed him inside. The fire was already lit. Furs lined the walls. Tools hung in careful rows. A pot simmered with something rich and earthy. A feather rested near the window, as if guarding the light. Tohano stepped aside, letting her pass. He pointed toward a pile of folded blankets, a corner laid out for her with quiet intention. Not command, not claim, just space. Lilah sat without speaking. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from not knowing what came next. He knelt near the hearth, tending the fire. The light flared, painting the room in amber and gold. She looked at the comb again, now set gently on the windowsill. The turquoise glinted like a sliver sky. He didn't press her, didn't explain himself. Just let the silence settle. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, Lilah pulled the blanket around her shoulders and stared at the flames, thinking of her mother's lullabies and her sister's waving hand. She tried to feel nothing, but something had already begun, small and slow as warmth creeping into numb fingers. She didn't cry, but she didn't look away when Tohano sat down across from her, either. The silence wasn't empty anymore, just waiting. The days that followed moved without names, marked only by the shift of light across the floorboards and the way the wind curled beneath the eaves. In the house Tohano built, silence came not from absence, but from intention, measured, constant, and strangely kind. Lilah rose early out of habit. Her body remembered chores long after her heart had forgotten the use of them. She gathered snow in a tin basin, chopped kindling until her palms burned, swept the threshold where pine needles gathered like forgotten letters. Tohano never stopped her. He watched, yes, quietly, respectfully, but never interfered. He left at dawn most days, returning only as the sky began to bruise toward evening. He never said where he went, and Lilah never asked. She preferred not knowing. It gave her a kind of freedom, the belief that if she wished, she could vanish before nightfall and not be missed. She considered it on the fourth day. She packed only what she'd come with, her mother's hair ribbon, a loaf of bread gone hard, a small knife she kept tucked in her boot. She walked until her lungs stung with cold and the sky turned iron gray. The trail back toward Sparrow's Hollow curved through thin woods, the kind where sound vanished fast, swallowed by snow and solitude. By midday, she had almost convinced herself it was the right choice. But then came the howls, low and layered, like morning layered on rage. The sound of wolves, not far off. And she was alone. She turned around. By nightfall, she stumbled back into the clearing, breath shallow, legs aching. Smoke curled from the chimney. The door was open. Tohano stood just inside, holding out a blanket. He didn't ask her where she'd gone. He didn't speak at all. He simply stepped aside, and when she collapsed by the fire, he set down a bowl of warm stew beside her. It scent rich with something wild and earthy. She didn't thank him, but she ate every bite. After that, she stayed. The house itself was a kind of companion. The walls breathed with the wind, groaning softly like an old man shifting in sleep. Pots clinked when touched. Shelves held bundles of herbs wrapped in sinew and hide. A carved mask hung above the fire, its face unreadable, not unlike Tohano's. Lilah began to notice the way he moved. Always with care. He handled tools like they were fragile things. Every motion meant something. When he set traps in the snow, his fingers traced them like prayers. When he prepared hides or carved bone, he did so with reverence, like someone honoring the past. There was no waste in him, and though he did not speak often, when he did, his voice came low and calm, like wind through dry reeds. She learned that his mother had been a healer, that the land around the valley had been his grandmother's before soldiers came, that he believed dreams were warnings, and smoke could carry thoughts if burned with sage. He never asked for anything. He gave small things. A set of polished stones placed on the windowsill, catching light. A comb, again, set not an offering now, but simply placed within reach, as though it belonged. Once, a piece of sweet root left near her boots, freshly pulled, earth still clinging to its fibers. She did not return them, but she began to cook better. She mended the curtain that hung crooked over the narrow window. She aired the bedding. She found herself humming once while grinding herbs and stopped, startled. Still, she said little. The silence between them was never awkward, though. It held space for grief, for questions unformed. It stretched like the valley outside, endless, but not empty. One night, as the fire dipped low and the wind tapped at the walls like a child wanting in, she asked without looking up, "Why do you keep a feather near the window?" He was carving something small from antler, but his hand stilled. She heard the knife pause on bone. "It was my sister's," he said. She turned her head. She was taken. Years ago. Soldiers came when I was just grown. Said they needed someone to question. My father was away. She was small. They took her. He looked into the flames. I never found her. The silence grew different then, heavier, a thing alive between them. I keep it near the window, he went on. So if she comes, she'll know this is still home. Lilah didn't reply. Her fingers tightened on the blanket. She thought of Ruth, small and light-haired, standing in that church with confusion in her eyes. The next day, Lilah found a pine branch heavy with early buds and hung it near the door. It was something I used to do to keep luck in and spirits out. She didn't explain it, and Tohano didn't ask. But later, she noticed he had woven red thread through it. Another evening, as they walked back from the woods, she had offered, finally, to help him gather bark and roots. She slipped on the slick path near the stream. Her foot slid out beneath her, and the world tilted fast. Tohano caught her before she hit the ground. His arms closed around her waist with instinct and precision, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She laughed, sharp, surprised, real. He let go quickly, his hand steady, but his eyes uncertain. "You all right?" he asked. It was the first time he'd spoken English directly to her. She nodded, breath-catching. "Just the ice trying to teach me a lesson." He smiled then, barely, but it changed his face, softened the angles, brought warmth to the stillness. That night, they ate by the fire again. She served seconds. He accepted. When she went to sleep, she did not turn her face to the wall. And when she woke, the comb was gone from the windowsill. Not taken, just moved. Nestled gently beside her brush, as if it had always belonged there. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore. It had shape now, a rhythm. She still thought of home, sometimes. Of Ruth, of the wide emptiness of the farmhouse, the smell of ma's bread, the sound of wind through bare trees. But Sparrow's Hollow felt distant now, like a town in a book she once read. Here, in a house made of patience and pinewood, something was changing. Not fast, but enough that she noticed the stillness was no longer heavy. It was beginning to feel like peace. Snow melted in hushes that week, dripping from the eaves like soft-spoken confessions. The wind had lost its bite, and in its place came birdsong, thin and uncertain, as though even the sparrows weren't sure winter was truly done. The world outside Tohano's cabin stirred with the first tremors of thaw, but inside something else began to shift, quietly, like the weight of old grief adjusting on someone's back. Lilah took to brushing her hair by the hearth, slow strokes with the carved comb, turquoise winking in the light. She didn't tell him why, didn't announce her change of heart, but he noticed. She saw it in the way his eyes lingered, not possessive, never, but with a kind of reverence, like he'd been waiting for her to see herself as worth tending. Then came the fever. It snuck in like a thief in the night. Sweat on her brow, shivers in her bones, pain that bloomed behind her eyes and made her limbs ache like she'd been fighting in dreams. She tried to hide it, stubborn as her mother once was, but Tohano knew. He found her slumped near the wash basin, breath coming ragged, the comb fallen to the floor. She remembered the coolness of his arms lifting her, the way he laid her in her bedroll without words, and the hush in the room as he pressed damp cloths to her skin. Time dissolved. She slipped in and out of waking like a swimmer breaking the surface, each breath too loud in her chest. Once, she opened her eyes to the sight of him seated cross-legged beside her, murmuring in Apache, not to her, not really, to the fire, to the night, to someone long gone. The feather, his sister's feather, rested in his hands as he spoke. He stroked it once, like it still breathed, and laid it on her pillow before she slipped back into darkness. She dreamed of Ruth, of home, of lilacs blooming too early and birds falling from the sky. She dreamed of soldiers who didn't speak and fires that wouldn't warm. When she woke, truly woke, the fever had broken. Her skin was slick with sweat, and the cabin smelled of boiled sage and wood smoke. Outside, the snow had retreated into shaded places, leaving behind patches of brown earth and early green. Tohano sat nearby, carving again, always carving. And this time it was a tiny bear, crouched low, as if tracking something unseen. She stirred. He looked up. "You're back," he said simply. She blinked at him, dazed by how different his voice sounded when wrapped in relief. "You stayed." He nodded once. "Wasn't going to leave." Her eyes caught the feather now tucked just beside her, its edges slightly frayed. "I thought it was for your sister," she said. "It still is," he replied. "But I thought she might lend it to you." A beat passed. She let her fingers graze the feather's edge. It was softer than she expected, fragile, kept whole only because someone had taken care not to break it. Later that day, Lilah stood for the first time in days. Her legs wobbled. Tohano didn't reach for her, but he watched, every inch of her progress noted with quiet attention, the way a man might track stars. She managed to pour herself water, then sit by the fire. The bear carving was finished now, its paws smooth, its back hunched against imagined wind. She picked it up, examined it, then set it back down beside the feather. "You carve all your feelings?" she asked, half smiling. "Only the ones I can't say." "And the ones you can?" He met her gaze then, held it longer than he ever had. "I wait." That night she cooked. Just stew, simple and slow, using what roots they had left and meat he'd brought in from a silent morning hunt. It wasn't her best, but he ate 3 bowls without a word, which meant more than any compliment. They sat together as twilight swallowed the forest. No lamps lit, just fire and shadows and breath. She spoke first. "My mother used to sing when she was sick," she said softly. "Said songs kept death polite." Tohano nodded. "My sister used to braid my hair when I had fevers. Said it kept the ghosts out." "Did it work?" He gave a wry smile. "Still here, aren't I?" She leaned her head back, staring up at the smoke hole in the ceiling, where stars peeked through like shy children. "I think your sister would have liked me," she said after a while. "I think she would have protected you," he answered, and there was something new in his voice. Not just grief. Something gentler. Grief softened by hope. The next morning, she asked to go with him. He was heading to check snares along the ridge. The path was steep, the air thin with meltwater mist, but she didn't falter. Not once. He didn't offer to carry her, and she didn't ask. They walked in silence for a time, and then she began to hum, not loud, not full of joy, but steady. A tune from home. A tune from before. Tohano glanced at her once, and his mouth twitched upward. When they reached the ridge, she gasped, not from exertion, but from the view. The whole valley stretched beneath them, patched with green and lingering snow, wildflowers nudging through soil as though testing the season. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded. "I come here when I need to remember." "Remember what?" "That life returns." She stood close to him, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat radiating off his shoulder. The wind lifted strands of her hair, and he reached out, not abruptly, not as a claim, but to tuck one behind her ear. She didn't flinch. She didn't move away. Back at the cabin, she placed the bear carving beside the comb and the feather on the shelf, all of them lined in a neat row, as though cataloging small salvations. Tohano watched her, but said nothing. And when she lit the fire that night, she let it burn long past warmth. The feather did not move from the windowsill, but the house felt fuller somehow. More lived in. More claimed. She slept well, and in her dreams she saw her sister again. But this time, Ruth was running toward her, not away. The thaw came in hushes, like a woman deciding whether to forgive. Snow slipped from branches with soft thuds. Creek ice cracked in jagged lines, and the earth gave its first green sighs beneath the sun. Birds returned in slow waves, their songs uncertain after so much silence. Life resumed, but it did not forget. Tohano spoke little of the message he received, only that the red willow elders had requested his presence at Sparrow's Hollow for the treaty renewal. Lilah didn't ask questions. She only nodded and reached for the dress she'd mended weeks ago, one of soft blue, wool patched at the hem. She plaited her hair by the firelight, her fingers unsure, but patient. He waited near the doorway with 2 satchels, both packed light. On the table, between her brush and the small bear carving, lay the comb. She tucked it into her braid without looking back. They rode at dawn. The valley had shed most of its snow, the path muddy but passable. Trees bloomed too early, full of risk and beauty, and crows called out warnings no one understood. Tohano rode close enough to shield her from the wind, but gave her distance still, like always. A quiet choice. A courtesy. They didn't speak until the town came into view. Sparrow's Hollow looked smaller now, its edges more brittle than she remembered. Homes sagged with winter's weight, and fences leaned like old men in prayer. But it wasn't the buildings that made her gut tighten. It was the eyes. The stares began before their horses slowed. She felt them, sharp, disbelieving, full of hunger for something to judge. Women paused at wash lines, fingers frozen on clothespins. Children peeked around corners and were pulled back quickly. Men leaned against porch posts with arms crossed and mouths closed. Tohano's chin lifted, but his gaze stayed forward. Lilah gripped the saddle horn and kept her back straight. At the general store, Mrs. Prim was waiting, lace gloves folded like she was cradling a prayer too mean to say aloud. "Well," she sniffed, "they do let you wear colors now." Lilah met her eyes. "And you still let your mouth go without thinking." The older woman's lips thinned. They passed the saloon, the schoolhouse, the chapel. No one smiled. Marshal Holt was the only man to nod in their direction, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He stepped out from under the sheriff's awning and offered a slow gesture of greeting. "Miss Vance," he said, eyes flicking toward Tohano with the weight of knowing, "you come back different." "I came back the same," she replied. "You just never saw me whole." That earned her a blink and a quiet chuckle, half pity, half pride. The council met at the old courthouse. Inside, the elders of both sides sat on opposite benches, the long table between them worn thin by years of uneasy compromise. Lilah stayed by the door, her presence noted but unwelcomed. Tohano stood tall before the circle of faces, speaking only when asked. He answered with clarity, with restraint, with a calm that seemed to make some of the settlers more uneasy than if he'd shouted. Someone asked, loud enough to carry, "And your bride, does she know she's a pawn in this game or just a prize?" Lilah stepped forward before she could stop herself. "I know what I was," she said, "and I know what I chose to become." Murmurs rippled. The councilman who'd spoken looked away. They left the courthouse in silence. Outside, the wind had changed. A storm not yet born clung to the air like tension before a slap. As they walked toward their horses, a man Lilah barely recognized, young, swaggering, liquor in his step, shouted after them, "Tell me, Apache, does she bleed red or does your kind have different rules?" Tohano stopped. He did not turn, but Lilah did. "She bleeds," she said calmly, "only when fools think they have something worth wounding." The man stepped forward. Too close. Marshal Holt moved quicker. "That's enough," he snapped, hand resting near his holster. "This town's peace is signed in blood already. Don't go asking for more." The young man sneered, but backed off. The crowd thinned, but the heat of judgment lingered, like smoke after a barn burns down. Lilah walked toward her horse, her heartbeat even, her shoulders square. Tohano watched her the entire time, not to protect, not to lead, just to witness. Later, back in the quiet of their cabin, Lilah removed her dress slowly, folding it as though preserving something sacred. She stood in her shift by the fire and didn't speak for a long time. Tohano sat across from her, polishing the hilt of a blade. The feather rested on the windowsill, catching gold light in each threadbare strand. "I thought I was going to cry," she said softly. He looked up. "Why didn't you?" "Because today I remembered what it feels like to stand on my own feet." A silence passed, not heavy this time, but deep, full. He set the blade down. She crossed the space between them and reached for his hand. He took it. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The contact was enough, a kind of vow that couldn't be spoken and didn't need to be. The fire crackled beside them. Outside, the wind rose. In the dark corners of the town they'd left behind, rumors would blossom like mold. Lilah Vance had returned with feathers in her hair and no shame on her tongue. Some would say she'd been claimed. Others would say she'd been lost. But those stories didn't matter. Not here. Not anymore. And as she rested her head against Tohano's shoulder, his breath steady and warm beside her ear, she understood that peace had never been what the elders signed into parchment and promise. It was this: a hand held without flinching, a silence that held no threat, and the knowledge that even if the town burned again, she would not run. Spring came like a held breath finally released, slow, warm, almost apologetic. Wildflowers pushed through the thawed soil, their heads tilted like listeners. The valley grew fragrant with damp pine, new blossoms, and river water rushing free from its winter prison. In the quiet home beneath the ridge, Lilah Vance began to wake in ways she hadn't since childhood. It began with fatigue, a kind not fixed by rest. Then came the nausea, unpredictable as prairie storms. She stared at the fire one evening, her body betraying secrets her mind hadn't yet dared name. Tohano sat nearby, whittling a spoon from cedar, his movements methodical and calm. "I think I'm a child," she said softly, her hand resting just above her belly. The knife stilled. He didn't speak, not at first. He set the spoon aside and turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, as if each word required care, he whispered, "Are you certain?" She nodded. Certain enough. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. No fear, no disbelief, just awe so quiet it broke her heart. His shoulders trembled once before he reached for the feather on the windowsill and held it against his chest. "I prayed," he said. "Not for this, not exactly. I didn't think I'd earn it. But I prayed to be given something I could protect, something I could raise, without war in its shadow." She reached for his hand. He didn't take hers. He folded both of them around hers instead, as though sheltering a flame. That night, he moved her bedding closer to the hearth. He began to carve small things, a rattle, a cradle charm, a tiny buffalo with round eyes and crooked horns. He whispered stories to her belly when he thought she slept. He hung herbs by the rafters and consulted his mother's old medicine bundle, pulling from it the wisdom of plants and smoke. But news travels on wind quicker than footsteps, and sparrows hollow heard. No knock came to their door, no messenger sent. But one afternoon, a hawk feather was nailed into the gatepost of their fence, a mark of insult and warning. Tohano removed it without a word. Lilah stood at the window that night and felt old fear crawling back through her spine. She remembered the way the town looked at her, like a mistake too big to bury. She thought of Ruth, her wide eyes filled with unanswered questions. She thought of fire, and the fire came. It was near midnight when the dog barked, then silence, then a whoosh, soft and sudden, like a breath drawn too deep. Smoke slithered in through the doorframe, curling along the beams. When she threw open the door, she saw the corner of the house alight, flames blooming where oil had been poured. "Tohano!" she cried, grabbing the blanket from her bedroll, coughing already. He was outside before she finished a word, slamming a bucket into the rain barrel, dousing the blaze before it could claim the roof. Embers scattered into the dirt like fleeing insects. His arms moved like wind over stone, sure practiced. Then she saw them, 3 silhouettes, half drunk and grinning, lingering just beyond the tree line. One held a lantern, swinging it lazily. Another had a length of rope in one hand, the meaning clear enough. They did not speak, only stood, daring him to come forward. Tohano did. Lilah grabbed his arm, but he gently uncurled her fingers from his sleeve. "I won't let them bring war to this house," he said. She watched him walk into the dark, heart galloping, mouth dry. The man with the lantern stepped forward, arrogance written in every line of him. Then Tohano moved, not with fists, not with blade. He ducked a swing, turned the lantern out with one sweep, and drove the man to his knees in 3 heartbeats. The other 2 hesitated, unsure. Tohano stood between them and the cabin, tall, unmoved, the light from the fire glinting in his eyes. He didn't strike again. He simply spoke. "This child," he said, "is not Apache, not settler. This child is hope. And if you try to kill that, then you are the ones who've made peace a lie." The second man ran. The third dropped his rope and followed. Lilah exhaled for the first time in minutes. The fire was out. The house still stood. And in the distance, hoofbeats approached. Marshal Holt, rifle across his back, face lined with fury. "I'm arresting the one you knocked down," he muttered after seeing the smoldered damage. "He'll talk. And if he don't, I'll make sure he listens." He looked to Lilah, then, his voice lower. "You were never the fool in this town. They just couldn't stomach a woman who made her own peace." Weeks passed. The scars blackened on the cabin's frame, but didn't spread. Lilah's belly grew rounder. Tohano carved a cradle from juniper wood, humming as he worked. Every night, he laid the feather in the center of the finished piece, whispering to the child in the old tongue. When her time came, it was under a sky lit with stars, so clear it felt like the heavens were watching. She labored with sweat and grit, her cries swallowed by the mountains. Tohano held her through it, arms steady, words soft, never once letting her go. The child came in the hour just before dawn, slick and red and wailing like a storm's first roar. A girl. Lilah wept, not for pain, but for joy so deep it nearly undid her. Tohano placed the feather beside their daughter, his eyes wet. He whispered her name in Apache, Tohano, which meant returned light. By summer, word of the birth had spread past even the gossip's reach. And Sparrow's Hollow, ashamed, curious, afraid to admit wonder, came watching. They saw Tohano dancing in the naming ceremony, bare feet on the earth, arms lifted to the sun. They saw Lilah with flowers in her hair, her daughter cradled against her chest. Even Mrs. Prim came, and though she said nothing, her eyes stayed too long to be called indifferent. That night, as stars blinked awake, Lilah sat beside the fire, daughter asleep in her lap. She looked at Tohano, who was carving again, this time a woman holding a child in one hand and a comb in the other. "Did you always wait for her?" she asked. He didn't look up. "I waited for something I didn't have a name for," he said, "until you gave it one." She leaned into him, the baby between them, warm and whole. Outside, the world kept on. People judged, fences fell, storms gathered. But inside, a fire burned, not of destruction, but of promise. And peace, the kind earned in quiet and guarded with love, stayed lit. Not all treaties are written in ink. Some are carved with hands, kept in feathers, and passed from mother to child.